Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video as we dive into episode 4 of Christian Denominations from our friend Matt at Useful Charts. Been really enjoying this series. I've learned a lot. Hopefully you have as well. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive from all of you, so I'm excited to dive into parts 4, 5, and 6 this week. As always, there are links in the description, not only to part 1 of my reaction, so you can see the first 3 episodes if you haven't already, but also to the original. I highly encourage you, if you want to go and watch them ahead of time and then come back and watch them with my commentary to get some additional information and context to it. Let's go ahead and dive into part 4.
This is Matt Baker. Welcome to episode 4 in my series on the family tree of Christian denominations. Last time we reached the Protestant section of the tree and looked at the Lutheran, Anglican, and Reformed branches, all of which resulted in new state-level churches throughout Europe. In today's video, we're therefore going to switch gears and start to look at some of the more radical groups that emerged out of the Reformation. In particular,
and by saying radical, understand that that term just means that it's a bigger gap, a bigger departure from the original source material, so to speak, right? So, when you have the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church being kind of the predominant sects of Christianity for most of history, and then you have the Lutherans, the Reformed, the Anglicans growing up out of that, when you look at their belief system, the doctrine, the practice of worship itself, the worship service, there's not a huge difference between Catholicism and those other branches, right? You'd see a lot of similarities. So when he says radical, what we're talking about now is a much bigger departure, and we're going to start to see a bigger gap develop between different types of Christianity.
we'll be looking at the Anabaptists, the Brethren, and the Quakers, which together are often called the peace churches because they are all pacifist. I'll also be talking about the Puritans and the situation in the early American colonies.
So I want to say, too, and I want to try to not interrupt too much here at the beginning, but it makes a lot of sense for pacifist sects to emerge during this time because you're coming out of a couple of hundred years where with the Protestant Reformation, there are some very serious and very bloody conflicts that happen. You know, you have in England, you have Bloody Mary, right? Where you go from Protestants persecuting Catholics to Catholics persecuting Protestants. In France, you have some very deadly wars that happen. In Germany, you have an extremely bloody war that develops. So there's a lot of fighting going on between Protestant and Catholic. And so then out of this develops new groups of Christians who are going to very much lean on the side of opposing war altogether.
As well as some important changes that I've made to the overall chart. Originally, I had planned to cover the Baptists in this episode as well. Note that the Baptists are different from the Anabaptists. However, I'm now going to cover them in more detail in episode 5, alongside the Methodists. Altogether, this series will likely have 7 episodes. So if at the end of this video you're left wondering why I didn't mention a particular denomination, well, just remember that there's more episodes to come. You can check the description to see what's available so far. Also, as I mentioned last time, the full chart, once completed, will be available as a poster. But if you're watching this in early 2023, it's not ready yet because I'm still making changes as I go. Again, check the description box for the details.
I'll definitely be getting that poster when it's available. Episode 6 just came out, by the way, so he's still working on this series.
So speaking of changes, let me show you a few things I've done since last time. First of all, I've added some infographics at the top. On the left, I have the 10 largest Christian communions worldwide. Basically, each church icon represents 10 million members.
So that's really interesting, and I want to take a look at that for a second here. So Eastern Orthodox, Anglican Communion, World Communion of Reformed Churches. So those are all ones we've talked about, the Catholics. Methodists we'll get to, which the Methodists grow out of the Anglican Church, led by guys like Charles Wesley and John Wesley. I should say John Wesley. Charles was more of a hymn writer. Lutheran World Federation. You got the Assemblies of God, which is a Pentecostal denomination that develops in the early part of the 20th century. Oriental Orthodox, Baptist World Alliance, and then Seventh-day Adventist, which is another fairly new one that is going to kind of grow up and be really radical, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
So, as you probably know, the Catholic Church is by far the largest Christian group in the world, with around 1.35 billion members. Second is the Eastern Orthodox Church, with 200 million. With one exception, the rest of the list is all Protestant. So coming in at number 3 is the Anglican Communion, followed by the Reformed churches, the Methodists, and the Lutheran World Federation. All of these groups have around 80 million members. We then have the Assemblies of God, which is a Pentecostal denomination that I've not yet talked about. We probably won't get to them until episode 7. Then we have the Oriental Orthodox churches. Remember, these are different from the Eastern Orthodox churches. We talked about them in episode 1, and they include the Coptic Church and the Ethiopian Church. Finally, we have the Baptist World Alliance with around 48 million members, and the Seventh-day Adventists with 22 million. I'll be talking about the Baptists in episode 5 and the Adventists in episode 6. On the right-hand side of the chart, I've added this map showing the dominant type of Christianity by country. So first of all, note that on this map, green represents any type of Protestant, whereas yellow is Catholic, red is Eastern Orthodox, and purple is Oriental Orthodox.
And it should be noted, too, that in many of those countries, the dominant belief system would actually be either agnostic or atheist or just non-religious. Especially in Europe, that's certainly the case. I would say many of those European countries, the percentage of people who would identify as Christians is probably well below half at this point.
The gray areas are those countries where Christianity is very much in the minority, representing less than 10% of the total population. Okay, on the main chart, I've made some changes as well. For example, once again, I've had to fix the Georgian Orthodox Church. I initially had it stemming from Russia and then from Constantinople. However, it was actually granted independence from Antioch, so I've added a line to make that clear. I've also added 2 extra groups stemming from the Catholic Church, but separate from the Protestants. The first is the Philippine Independent Church, which broke away in 1902 and is now in communion, among others, with the Anglicans. That's why they are colored purple. Note that I've also changed the Union of Utrecht Catholics to be purple as well.
So one of the things I really love, and I've mentioned this before, but is that you can see how he's learning as these videos come out. And that always happens with the videos that I do as well. I'll make a comment, and remember, most of these videos, unless I indicate at the beginning that I've seen it before, or you see me pause and say I want to look that up and find out more, for the most part, I'm doing these reactions just kind of off the top of my head from knowledge that I've already gained over the years, and kind of just doing things on the fly in real time. So there's always going to be a time when I say something and then somebody corrects me later. And when possible, if it's a pretty significant thing that I've gotten wrong, or it's something that I've asked a question about and someone's answered, always look for the pinned comments in my reaction videos, because if there's something really important I want people to see that someone else has said, or that I am updating and adding additional context, I'll pin that comment. Because we're always about accuracy. We want to make sure we're getting the right information. We're here to learn together. And those of us who are making these videos, whether it's original content or reactions, we are learning as much from you guys as you are hopefully learning from us.
Because they too are in communion with the Anglicans. The second edition is SSPX, which stands for the Society of St. Pius X. Their status is kind of up in the air. They are different from the Sedevacantists because they do not claim that the current pope is illegitimate. However, in 1988, their leader, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, consecrated several new priests without the Pope's permission, creating a controversy that is yet to be resolved. Over here, beneath the Armenian Church, I've added a few medieval groups that have come up in the comments quite a bit, namely the Paulicians, Bogomils, and Cathars. I'll explain who they are and why I decided to add them to the chart, not in today's episode, but in episode 5, when I talk about the Baptists. So I'm going to keep you in a bit of suspense for now. However, another medieval group, the Lollards, I've added over here. They were a proto-Protestant group inspired by the early English Bible translator John Wycliffe. So I felt that they deserved to be included alongside the Waldensians and the Hussites.
Yeah, I was actually kind of surprised we didn't say the Lollards sooner.
Also fit under the category of Protestants before Protestants. Let's now move over to the Anglican section. Note that I've added the Scottish Episcopal Church alongside the Church of Scotland. For a while during the 1500s and 1600s, it was unclear which one of these would end up being the state Church of Scotland. In the end, Presbyterianism won out. However, I decided to show the Scottish Episcopal Church on the chart as well, due to its connection to the Episcopal Church in the U.S. You see, when the American colonies broke away from Great Britain, their bishops could no longer be consecrated by the Church of England, because that would require taking an oath of allegiance to the king. So in order to get around this, they were consecrated by the Scottish Episcopal Church instead. By this point, the Scottish Episcopal Church was independent from the Church of England and was not the state church in Scotland. Therefore, no oath to the king was needed. Now on to the Reformed section. Last time I failed to mention the two main Reformed denominations in the U.S. The oldest one is the Reformed Church in America, which started off as a branch of the Dutch Reformed Church. Most of its members merged with a Lutheran synod in 1934 to form the ENR Church, which then went on to become part of the United Church of Christ.
In the last episode, this was kind of a cool thing that happened. I made a comment about how, for example, in certain parts of the country, you would see a Lutheran church and a Reformed church or a UCC church today, maybe right next to each other, like in the same part of town, and sometimes even sharing a cemetery or sharing the same building. And somebody commented in the comment section and said that they were from Boalsburg, Pennsylvania, and that they had that situation there. And that was actually the specific town that I was thinking of when I made that comment, because my wife's grandmother was born in Boalsburg, and her family is buried in one of those Lutheran cemeteries.
However, some of those in the Reformed Church in America remained separate and kept the name, and therefore that church still exists to this day. In addition to this, the Christian Reformed Church had previously broke away from them in 1857, and that church still exists too. When it comes to the Presbyterian part of this section, I decided to add the two largest Presbyterian churches in Korea, as they are the main churches in that country, and together they represent the largest group of Presbyterians in the world. Originally, they were a single church, but they split up in 1959. The original church was planted by American Presbyterians, so I showed the connection back to them as well. Okay, with that out of the way, we can now focus on the main topic for today, the Anabaptists and the Quakers. These two groups are very different from the Lutherans, Anglicans, and Reformed that we discussed last time. You see, when the Reformation occurred in places like Germany, England, and Switzerland, it's not as if all the Catholic churches in those places were shut down and new Lutheran, Anglican, and Reformed churches were established. No, instead, most of the Catholic churches in those places simply switched to become Lutheran, Anglican, or Reformed churches. And in many cases, the new type of Christianity was established as the state-sponsored religion. So in other words, the Lutheran, Anglican, and Reformed churches weren't actually new churches. They were simply old churches that changed their theology, and in some cases their practices, but usually only a little bit and slowly over time. In contrast, all of the groups that we're going to discuss from this point forward were actually new groups that were radically different from the Catholic Church.
And it's important, again, as I mentioned earlier, to understand the context of that word radical. Because I think sometimes in modern parlance, when we hear the term radical, we think of extreme. We think of kind of crazy people, like those people are radical, like they're way out of here. All it really means, historically speaking, is a dramatic departure from what has been normal. So in the 1860s, for example, you have what are called the radical Republicans, which are just people who aren't kind of, like Abraham Lincoln's a pretty moderate Republican, right? So he advocates for things like maybe a gradual emancipation, or maybe not emancipation at all, but rather just opposes expansion of slavery. But the radical Republicans are saying, no, we want abolition, we want it now. And then when you get to the end of the war and Lincoln is still a moderate and he's on board with emancipation, the radicals are now saying, no, we want citizenship, we want the right to vote, we want all of these things, full equality. So in this case, Lutherans, Anglicans, Reformed are Protestant, but they're not a huge departure from the norm.
Not only in theology, but also in practice. When it comes to the Anabaptists, one of the practices that they were most concerned with was baptism. In the Catholic Church, as well as in the Lutheran, Anglican, and Reformed churches, Christians are usually baptized as infants. The Anabaptists thought this was unbiblical because infants are not able to understand what is happening or to make a conscious commitment to follow Jesus.
And this really comes down to a difference in theology as far as what baptism is. Is baptism an act that comes after a person has come to faith in Christ? Or is baptism something that makes it possible for somebody to have faith in Christ in the first place? Is baptism something that is irrelevant as far as our own conscious nature? Some churches are going to say that baptism is what makes it possible for us to even follow Christ in the first place. Other people say baptism is just symbolism and it really doesn't mean anything. Other people would say baptism is what actually cleanses you of your sins. And so there's all these different views on that.
Instead, they felt that people should only be baptized once they were old enough to understand and believe and make the decision for themselves. The initial Anabaptists therefore baptized themselves again, which is why they ended up being called Anabaptists, meaning re-baptizers. However, the original Anabaptists simply called themselves Brethren. The movement started in Switzerland, so the term Swiss Brethren is also sometimes used for these initial Anabaptists. One of their early leaders was a man named Menno Simons. He helped spread Anabaptist ideas in the Dutch Republic, and hence the largest branch of the Anabaptists eventually became known as the Mennonites. However, in 1693 there was a schism in which some of the Mennonites left to follow a man named Jacob Amman. From that point forward, those who broke off became known as the Amish. There is a third main group as well, known as the Hutterites, named after Jacob Hutter, who helped spread Anabaptist ideas to Austria and further east. Now these days, all three of the original Anabaptist groups are mostly associated with simple living, old-fashioned clothes, and a rejection of modern technology. However, it is important to note that when it comes to the rejection of technology, there is actually a wide range of practices among Anabaptists today. Generally speaking, it's really only the Amish who reject almost all modern technology. For example, they are well known for still using the horse and buggy instead of cars. But even among the Amish, there is at least one group, the Beachy Amish, who, for example, will use the internet, albeit in a restricted way.
Yeah, and the different ordnungs, the different groups of Amish they vary wildly, and a lot of times people equate the Amish with Mennonites because there are some similarities, but in practice they're very different. And I live here in Northeast Ohio, which is one of the largest Amish communities in the world. Not specifically in the town where I live, but I can go a half hour from here, and there's a huge Amish community over in, say, Geauga County, Ohio. And so in many ways, a lot of the people that I know that go to my church, things like that, work regularly with the Amish. They will drive the Amish because a lot of them, they aren't opposed to the use of technology. And a lot of times with the Amish and the Mennonites, you'll see that they just don't own the technology. You'll see them shopping at Walmart. You'll see them riding in vans. You'll see them using phones. They just don't own those things. And so it varies wildly from one group to another.
The Hutterites are the next most traditional group, but they tend to allow more colorful clothing, and in some cases even use cell phones. And the Mennonites? Well, aside from the Old Order Mennonites, who are very much in the minority, Most Mennonites no longer have any extreme restrictions on the use of technology. Conservative Mennonites still wear traditional clothing, but most Mennonites are actually indistinguishable from the average American. If you want to learn more about the Mennonites, I suggest you check out today's Ready to Harvest video, which I'll link to in the description.
We'll have to check them out at some point.
Hosted by Joshua, is all about the differences between Christian denominations. And he's almost at 100K subscribers. So if you haven't yet subscribed, I highly recommend that you do so. Now, I should point out that although the Anabaptists first emerged in Europe, many of them ended up migrating to North America. This is because initially, North America offered more freedom when it came to what religion a person could follow. However, some moved east towards Poland and then settled in Russia in the late 1700s.
Really?
While there, they were influenced by the radical Pietists, whom we'll be discussing next, and therefore they took the name Mennonite Brethren. Many of them ended up immigrating to North America as well, and kept that name, which distinguishes them from the other American Mennonites, who were originally split into two main conferences, but who merged in 2002 to form the Mennonite Church USA. Now, before I get to the Pietists, I want to point out two Anabaptist groups that emerged much later than the original three. These are the Apostolic Christian Church, established in 1832 by a man named Samuel Froelich, and the Bruderhof, established in 1920 by Eberhard Arnold. In both these cases, the founders were inspired by the earlier Anabaptist groups, but rather than join them, they founded new groups. The Bruderhof, like most of the Amish and Hutterites, live communally, whereas the Apostolic Christian Church, like most Mennonites, do not. Okay, I now want to talk about pietism, which is based on the word pious, meaning a strong devotion to one's religion. Unlike the Anabaptists, who emerged early on in the Reformation, the radical pietists emerged more than a century later, in the late 1600s and early 1700s. By this point, Lutheranism was firmly established in many areas of Europe. But some Germans and Scandinavians felt that the Reformation hadn't gone far enough. They wanted to go beyond mere discussions about theology and focus more on a religion of the heart. Some pietists wanted to change things from within the established churches.
So here is where you start to really see the move toward, and it happened with Luther as well, with Protestantism in general, but in the 1700s is when you really start to see the move toward what we would call today a personal relationship with Jesus. Because for a lot of history, Christianity was like, it was a communal thing. It was, you were a part of the church as a whole. Your faith was directly tied to the church, to the priest, to the fellow believers. Now you start to see a move toward people having kind of this personal relationship, and you talk about conversion experiences and things like that. And a lot of that grows up out of this pietism. It grows up out of Methodists. It comes up out of some of the organizations that grow up with the Brethren, with evangelicals, things like that.
But others were more radical and ended up establishing new groups instead. One of these more radical pietists was a man named Alexander Mack from Schwarzenau, Germany. He founded the Schwarzenau Brethren, also known as the German Baptists or Dunkers. The main denomination to come...
And if you're familiar with the Dunker name, that's because they had a church on the Antietam battlefield, known as the Dunker Church, or sometimes as the Dunkard Church.
Out of that movement was the Church of the Brethren. Note that although the Church of the Brethren emerged out of the Pietist movement and is often classified under the term Brethren, it was also heavily influenced by Anabaptism, and therefore is usually considered to fit under that umbrella as well. Another Anabaptist church that falls under the Brethren category is the River Brethren, founded by a former Mennonite. They are more traditional, like the Old Order Mennonites, and exist in far fewer numbers. Now, I want to point out that the term Brethren can be quite confusing, because there are several other totally unrelated churches that also use this same term, the most notable being the Plymouth Brethren. I'll discuss them in a future episode, but for now, just note that they are unrelated to the Anabaptist Brethren. I also want to point out a few churches that developed out of Pietism but are not associated with the Anabaptists, and are thus not peace churches. These include the Evangelical Church of America and the Evangelical Covenant Church. Both of these denominations emerged out of the Scandinavian free churches. Free churches being those that were not part of the state-sponsored churches, such as the Church of Sweden, Church of Norway, etc.
Okay. Yeah, and it's the Evangelical Free Church of America. Sometimes people just call them E-Free for short.
Okay, let's now talk about the Quakers. They are similar to Anabaptists in that they are pacifists, but they trace their origins to England instead of to continental Europe, and never did live in communal settings. As we learned last time, the Church of England was established in 1534 as the new state church. However, like in other areas, there were some in England that felt that the Reformation hadn't gone far enough. In England, these people became known as the Puritans. Most of the Puritans wanted to change the church from within, such as Oliver Cromwell.
And that's no different than what Luther tried to do with the Catholic Church, right? He was trying to reform it. He was not trying to break away from it. But as is often the case, when you try to, in your mind, what you try to fix what you feel is broken, and the people who have the power aren't willing to fix what you think is broken, then you say, well, then I have no choice but to start my own. And that's what ends up happening with the Lutherans. And these separatists, sometimes we lump them all together because America's founding is so intrinsically linked with the English separatists, people who came here for religious freedom. But we forget that they varied wildly in why they were separating and why they were looking for freedom. The people who settled Maryland were Catholics who were looking for that. The people who settled Massachusetts or Virginia or Pennsylvania or New York all came from different countries for different reasons. But for many of them, it was about religious freedom from the state church.
There were some who wanted to separate and form new denominations. These more extreme reformers became known as English separatists. Initially, there were many different types of English separatists. The Quakers were just one of them, as were the Baptists, which we'll be discussing next time. Some of the other groups
my own personal family has, at least on my paternal side, has deep connections with this part of history because my direct male line ancestors were Quakers. In fact, I had a couple of Quaker preachers, including a woman preacher who is one of my ancestors. I think she's like my 9th great grandmother, who was severely beaten and imprisoned several times up in northern England and eventually came to New Jersey and settled to get away from the persecution that was happening. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to brag about my ancestors and make you guys have to take a shot if you do the VTH drinking game. This is the actual marriage record from the U.S. Quaker meeting records for my direct male line 9th great grandparents. If you're not familiar, if you haven't seen my video about how I discovered who my biological father was, there's a video. In fact, I'll put a link at the end, a video that I did over on VTH Extra about finding who my father was through DNA. And I believe that Jarrett from Genia Vlogger is doing a reaction to that video, so be watching for that. So my direct male line, my father's last name is Snowden. That should be my last name then. So Snowden's my direct male line, and my 9th great grandfather was John Snowden. And this is the actual marriage record from, I believe it's 1685 is when they got married. Let me take a look. Let me go back. 1682, he married Ann Barrett in Burlington, New Jersey. He was a Bucks County, Pennsylvania associate judge and also served as a member of the PA Provincial Assembly. Died in Philadelphia in 1736. So those are my Quaker roots.
The Diggers, the Enthusiasts, the Ranters,
awesome
the Seekers,
names, by the way,
and my personal favorite, the Muggletonians. All of these movements,
my 2 kids, my oldest and my youngest, who are super into Harry Potter, need to know about the Muggletonians, I think.
Have since died out, but the Quakers and Baptists continue to this day. The main founder of Quakerism was a man named George Fox. When he was brought before the courts on charges of blasphemy, he told those gathered that they should tremble or quake at God's word. Probably a reference to Isaiah 66 verse 2, which says, "But this is the one to whom I will look, to the humble and contrite in spirit, who trembles at my word.
And there's also scriptures that talk about serving the Lord with fear and trembling, things like that.
This is why the followers of George Fox became known as Quakers, even though their official name is the Religious Society of Friends. One of the distinct aspects of Quakerism is their emphasis on the inner light, or the ability of every person to experience God from within. This is why traditional Quaker meetings are usually unplanned and involve a lot of silence, so that each person can listen carefully to God's voice within themselves.
And there's a scriptural basis that they will use for that, as will many people. For a lot of history, whether it was through Judaism or even the early days of Christianity, it was seen that you really kind of connected to God through your priest, and those sorts of things. And then you read in the New Testament, they talk about the priesthood of all believers. But you have this verse in Joel where it says, in the last days, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. And a lot of people look at that and they interpret that to mean, well, you know what, his Holy Spirit only used to speak through prophets or through priests, things like that. But now he speaks through everyone. And this is the practice of that, at least for Quakers.
Lucky for the Quakers and other English separatists, the origins of their movements coincided with the settling of the Americas. This allowed many of these controversial groups to avoid persecution by simply moving far, far away. Although that didn't always work either. And the Quakers ended up being persecuted in America as well.
Yeah, and see, here's the thing. What happens when they settle America is, depending on what group is the predominant settling of an area, then if other groups come along, they're just as likely to persecute those groups as they themselves were persecuted back in the old country. So there's such a degree of hypocrisy at work here with many of these groups where they break away because they feel like they're not being given freedom to worship, but then they deny that same freedom to other groups who break away from them or who don't agree with them. It's fascinating.
As I mentioned last time, among the first English separatists who came to America in the 1600s were the Congregationalists, who fit under the Reformed branch of Christianity. They were the dominant group in New England, and thus Congregationalism became the state religion in most of the New England states, including Massachusetts and Connecticut.
And yes, at that time, Maine was a part of Massachusetts and was until the early 19th century.
The early exception to this was Rhode Island, which was established by Roger Williams, who founded the first Baptist church in America there. We'll talk more about him next time, but for now, I want to focus instead on the middle colonies, just south of New England.
And you notice how the border is formed, the western border is the Appalachian Mountains. And yes, that is how it's pronounced by people who actually live in what we call Appalachia. Many people say Appalachian. Appalachian Mountains are the western border. The British government's going to have treaties with the Native American tribes who live west of here, even though for a while a lot of this is controlled by the French. And it's only going to be in the aftermath of the American Revolution that the modern borders, the western borders of a lot of these colonies are going to be formed.
This area was originally controlled by the Dutch. In 1657, a group of settlers living in what is today Flushing, Queens, wrote a letter to the governor asking that Quakers be allowed to worship there. In fact, they also wanted religious freedom to extend to all Christian groups, as well as to Jews and Muslims.
Very forward thinking.
Their request was denied, but the letter, known as the Flushing Remonstrance, ended up setting the stage for what would become the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Awesome.
The one that separates church and state and allows for the freedom of religion. Interestingly, one of the individuals who signed...
I'll take a little exception to what Matt says here. I understand what he means by saying separation of church and state, but let's just be clear. The words separation of church and state do not appear in the Constitution. They do not appear in the First Amendment. What it says is that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free practice thereof. Now, to men like Thomas Jefferson, that was that there was to be a clear line of separation of church and state. So there were many of the founding fathers who did subscribe to what we would call separation of church and state. For others, it was less defined. It was more about there not being a state church and that the government was not establishing a Church of America that everybody had to tithe and everybody had to belong to. It was more about keeping the government out of religion. Many other people say it's about keeping religion out of government. Like everything in our Constitution, it is up to interpretation.
The Flushing document was William Thorne, who happens to be one of my wife's direct ancestors.
Nice.
My wife is Jewish on her father's side and Quaker on her mother's side. Another step on the path towards religious freedom in America was the founding of Pennsylvania in 1681. It was founded by a Quaker named William Penn, who allowed people from all religious groups to come and settle in his colony.
Means Penn's Woods.
Not only did Quakers settle there, but also Anabaptist groups like the Mennonites and the Amish. However, in 1827, the Quakers experienced a major schism, with those following a man named Elias Hicks becoming known as the Hicksites. Hicks was an early abolitionist and was involved in the Underground Railroad, which helped black slaves to escape to the north. Today, the descendants of the Hicksites are those who belong to the Friends General Conference, the most liberal of the three main Quaker groups. The non-Hicksites eventually split into the Wilburites and the Gurneyites, with the Wilburites basically being slightly more conservative versions of the Hicksites, and the Gurneyites going in a totally new direction. Basically, the Gurneyites ended up becoming like other churches in America, with planned services, pastors, and more mainstream Christian beliefs. Most of the Gurneyite descendants today belong to the Friends United Meeting, although some belong to the smaller, more conservative Evangelical Friends Church. Now, before I go, I can't really bring up Quakers without addressing this. I think most people assume that Quaker Oats was a company started by Quakers.
Nope.
Well, this isn't actually true. The founder of the company simply named his product Quaker Oats because by then Quakers were associated with integrity and honesty, and he wanted to be associated with those traits as well. If you want to associate actual Quakers with a product, that product should be chocolate, not oats. All three of the big British chocolate companies that started in the 1800s, Cadbury's, Rowntree's, and Fry's, were all founded by Quakers.
Really?
Okay, so that was a look at the Anabaptists and Quakers.
Fantastic, as always. Thank you, Matt, for continuing to teach us these important parts of history because, again, you can't fully understand history without understanding the religion that drove much of that history. So many of our political movements, so many of the founding of countries and alliances and things that happen are so directly tied to religion. And there is no United States without these religious movements, because these religious movements are what in many cases drove people to settle the New World. There were other reasons too. I'm not saying it was the reason, but so many people came here because of those reasons. And it defined very early on some of the differences between North and South. Much of that was tied to where they came from and why they came. So looking forward to diving into the next 2 episodes in the coming days. As always, definitely check out Matt's channel and give him a like and a subscribe. He's certainly earned it in my book. Thanks for watching.